as the slides are brought up, let me say this to you. I have spent 26 years of my life working for some of the world's most admired companies, of which the last 20 years have been in HR. And although I have actively stopped from being a corporate HR leader in the summer of last year, I feel very passionate about HR. So I felt the sticker of I love HR is a very telling one, not just for me, but hopefully for all of us. So let me talk to you about supporting executives through transitions. And again, I find this to be a fascinating topic because although I have had the good fortune of working for some of the world's most admired companies, I find that this particular process is never as strong as it should be and never as robust as it could be. That's at least my humble impression. Let me share with you some statistics around that. So first off, I'm on a mission. This has been a passion project of mine for the last 20 years. Every time I join a new organization, I looked at the onboarding and the development program for the executive leaders. And guess what? Oftentimes, there is a lot of money spent on selecting and hiring the very best. And sometimes, a good portion of the funding is going towards developing them. But I find the initial start, once the best hire has been made, to making them as effective as you can, is oftentimes lacking. The leadership development programs, the coaching often kicks in a year, 2, 3, 4 years after the appointment of the leader. And so my mission is to bend executive transitions from failure towards the most successful and carefully crafted. Now, with that, let me start by sharing with you why executive transitions are so challenging. And I will use my own example to make the point here. So first off, you see there are multiple challenges that can come your way if you're being appointed into an executive position. When I was headhunted to go from BAT, a fast-moving consumer goods company, to join a pharmaceutical company called Roche, I faced 5 major challenges, although technically, and from an HR point of view, it's one appointment. So the first challenge I was faced with was that I was joining a new organization. As a matter of fact, I have worked in 7 industries over the last 26 years, and I have never, ever repeated an industry. So I've always transitioned from one industry to a new one, to a new one, to a new one, and I've done that 6 times over. So I joined the Roche organization, new company, didn't know really much about him. I joined the pharmaceutical sector, again, a sector that was new to me. I also received what I call the big promotion challenge. I had been a local HR leader. I had been an HR leader with an area responsibility. In my last position, I was a regional head of HR, looking after 8 countries in Europe. But boy, suddenly I'm the global head of HR, looking after a country footprint of 140. So setting up a quick alignment call, as I often used to do it in my European head of HR role, would not work because there's no single time zone that you can align with a 140 country footprint. The 4th challenge that I faced was what I call the corporate diplomacy challenge. It's a very nice word for saying what it actually is, which is politics. Now, I know nobody likes to admit that this thing called politics exists in their organization. Every time I speak to CHROs, they point out that we are the good ones. This stuff happens in our competitor companies. The reality is, though, as soon as I start the coaching engagement with some of the most senior executives, the politics are all over the place. So my humble experience has been that as soon as you move into the global headquarters of any large listed company, expect politics to come your way. And last but not least, you see that I was also faced with an international move challenge. Now, arguably, I moved from Germany, a German-speaking country, to the German-speaking part in Switzerland, Basel being the city. And that being said, although it's technically the same language, I'm sure you will agree with me that the cultural beliefs, the norms, the attitudes, what's a lived practice, what makes a good citizen in one country can be significantly different to the other one. And last but not least, and this was the funny part of my role, the irony was that this was a newly created position. Now, I moved into that position, and guess what happened? All the incumbents who had to give away a little bit of their remit, because that was the design of my new job, were completely pissed off by me starting to take over. Some were very happy to hand over the non-exciting part of their job to me, but those that had to give up the more exciting parts were not really pleased about it. So I was, irritating the heck out of some of my peers, and they were irritated by me claiming what had been my mandate and my job. So you see how quickly one single appointment can be a very tricky undertaking. And we're going to dig into that. And again, when I wrote my book, Mastering Executive Transitions, and I first stumbled upon this study, I could not believe it. 4 out of 10 executive leaders do not make it. Now, the most validated study that I found was from Heidrick & Struggles, one of the largest search firms in the world. They have placed over 20,000 executives over a 10-year time period. 18 months into those appointments, 40% of those execs were not in the role anymore. And by the way, promotions are excluded from this. And let's face it, it's very rare at that level to get a promotion already 18 months into your appointment. So if you're not fired, you're kind of still in role and trying to make it work. Now, there are 4 more studies, and you see them on the bottom of the slide, that all come to the same conclusion. Some say it's a little more risky to be appointed externally than being promoted internally, but in essence, 4 out of 10 do not make it. And so that brings us to the question of, how can this be? I'm an HR leader, such as you, and we know what goes into those appointments at those levels. Oftentimes, you have a search firm involved. They do all the interviewing, all the competency checking, all the background checks. You often have a psychometric tool involved. In my last company, Vodafone, we applied the Hogan assessment for the most senior hires. You then have not just one interview, but at the executive level, you have multiple interviews with stakeholders in the organization. If it's a C-level appointment, often the board gets involved, the chairman, the chairwoman, the head of the nominating committee, and so on. And despite all of that, 4 out of 10 do not make it. Now, I won't bore you with the top 10 reasons for failure. If you wanted to read them, get your hands on a copy of my book, and there's a full chapter dedicated to that. But if I wanted to give you the executive summary of the top 3 reasons for executive failure, it's culture, it's people, and it's politics. So, probably not a surprise to anyone here. It's rare that you go and hire a chief finance officer and he or she isn't really good with the numbers. It's almost impossible to hire a chief HR officer and he or she really doesn't get the people agenda. So it's not the technical skills that gets in the way, but it's culture, people, and politics. Now, some of you might be thinking by now, holy moly, this must be surely very, very expensive, right? If at that level you hire someone or promote someone and they don't make it, they don't cut it, how much is that going to cost? Now, I have done the research, and my research comes to the conclusion that it costs somewhere between 10 to 30 times the executive salary if they fail already shortly after they're being appointed. Now, when I was in my first HR role, I was appointed as an assistant HR manager for the world-famous 3 Stripes, Adidas. I did a project on attrition, and back then the research was suggesting that attrition cost the company roughly 2.5 times the cost of the hire. So if you hire an assistant HR manager or he or she doesn't work out in the first 3 or 6 months, you have a replacement cost, you have the role being empty for some time, you may be having some negative effects into the organization. So all of that results in a 2.5 times the salary. But imagine you hired a CEO with a big mandate, and he so spectacularly fails after 9 months. You can see how quickly this is a lot more expensive than 2.5 times the salary of that same CEO. So you see, this is a very expensive undertaking. Now, again, I have 156 citations in my book. It took me 7 years from start to finish to write this book. But I believe you will not be surprised to hear that this was the easiest part of the research. Just go on Google, type in epic CEO transition failures. You will be finding thousands of examples for that. Now, why did I pick CEOs? Because I wanted to make the point that when I speak about executive transition failure, even the #1 position isn't immune from the 40% failure rate. And I give you 4 examples of some of the world's most admired companies. SAP, arguably the only real successful software company outside of Silicon Valley. They had a spectacular CEO transition failure at the very top. Jennifer Morgan is the name of the lady, and she so spectacularly failed after 6 months after being appointed. Leo Apotheker, Hewlett-Packard, a champion. When I was young, Hewlett-Packard stood for everything computers and printers. Today, they have branched into other segments such as architecture, servers, cloud, and so on and so forth. They brought in this chap called Leo Apotheker, established CEO. He so spectacularly failed after 10 months. It was one of the largest payout packages. You see, 7.2 million, it's just the severance package of the gentleman. It doesn't count in all the ripple effects of all the wrong transformational efforts he tried to so brutally drive into the organization. Boeing. I flew with Emirates to come to Mumbai 2 days ago. If you are flying on any commercial airline, there are essentially 2 players left. Imagine if in your industry, I take the example of Groupe Renault, if there were only 2 car manufacturers in the world, that would be a dream come true. This gentleman, Harry Stonesifer, used to be the successful CEO of Boeing. He had stepped down into a board role, and the CEO failed badly. And after 18 months, the board was getting nervous. So the chairman asked him, Harry, would you like to do it again? He said, sure, write me this check, I'll do it for you. Although he had been successful previously as a CEO, he spectacularly failed shortly after a year of being appointed. Why? Because he had been sleeping over what had been a big cultural change in the organization. So he assumed, I'm going to do the copy and paste formula. What had made me successful in the past, I would just copy and paste it into my new, old role, and guess what? It didn't work. And last but not least, the president and CEO of Uber. It's an undisclosed sum, but I leave it to your imagination to think of the severance package that was paid to this young man by a billionaire founder that I know has made some headlines, not necessarily in a positive way. So you see, the CEO transition failures or executive transition failures do not stop at the door of some of the most successful companies. Now, arguably, the highest price is paid by the executive. I think it's fair to say that HP is not going to go bankrupt by chucking out $7.2 million to a failed CEO. But what is the likelihood of that gentleman landing another job that is equally or bigger than the one that he so spectacularly failed at? What would you say if you were a headhunter and he were to ring you up to say, hey, I'm available again in the market. What exciting opportunities do you have for me? How would you feel about putting that profile forward to a prospective employer after everyone knows that whatever the gentleman tried was really not great? So you see, my claim is that the highest cost is actually paid by the executive. And of course, it's expensive for the organization too. Now, surely there's got to be a business case of how we can get this right. And again, the time won't allow us to go into all of that today. But I have brought with me 4 concrete examples of how you can improve executive transitions in your organization. So first off, I think it's a bit of a no-brainer to think about the fact that if you get this process right, you will have dividends at the individual level, at the organization level, and at the stakeholder level. Now, if you were to pull one lever, only one, forget about all the things you could do, and that lever is make sure next time you have a transition at the executive level, you bring in someone who can help you with that transition. That executive is being supported by what I call an executive transition coach. It's not just me. There are many more of us out there. We're not leadership development coaches. We're not life coaches. We're not business coaches. We call ourselves an executive coach, but the specialization is supporting executives during critical transitions. So you see how suddenly you start to get a real bang on the buck. A research that was conducted by Russell Reynolds, another large search firm, found out that 90% of the cost of bringing in a new executive leader is spent on hiring, selection, and interviewing process of that leader. And less than 10% is spent on making that same hire successful when they have been appointed. In my book, I talk about the imbalance of investment, right? Think of the 7.2 million, think of the 2.5 million, think of the 1 million, think of your 250,000. What if you were to spend 10% of that sum to make that executive more successful as and when they are appointed? So let me give you not 7, but only 4 key interventions here. And first off, I speak about the golden thread. What I mean by that is, if you really wanted to be a game-changing improvement to this process, you need to work at 3 different levels. First off, it's the executive. He or she can do things that will benefit their transition. Secondly, we are all in HR, so HR surely has a role to play. Oftentimes, HR is the custodian of the onboarding process, also for the executives. And third but not least, the board needs to be supportive of that. If it's at the lower level, the CEO typically needs to own this process. Who other than the CEO should have an inherent desire and motivation to make sure that everyone who joins the C-suite is absolutely going to be successful, next to the HR person, which is a prerequisite in my books. Now, the first one, I already gave that away to you. Get yourself an executive transition coach. You will not only reduce the derailment risk by at least 50%, you will give a head start to that exec to be more effective more quickly. I talk about faster acceleration, de-risk. The second key takeaway I want to share with you is, please, please, get the basics right. You see the first 3 items are what I call the onboarding basics. Admin arrangements. Someone knows that someone is coming. They have a laptop. They have a software installed on the laptop. They have access to the building, access to the intranet. Everything they need is already done. Good. Business orientation, induction days. We all have them. Half a day, 1 day, sometimes fragmented. It's good. Legal and procedural formalities, compliance training, all good. But as soon as we start into moving what I call higher value activities, you need to get those rights. Aligning expectations with teams and bosses. Organizing meetings with key stakeholders. And for that, you need to map the stakeholder universe for the C-suite. And last but not least, this is what killed Leah Apotheker and HP, facilitating cultural familiarization. It is of no help to anyone to come into a new role and start to mention the examples of your previous company all the time. Oh, at GE we did this. Oh, at GE we did that. You're not at GE anymore. You're now in this other company. So make sure you earn the right to bring about change, whether it's culturally or procedures. Intervention number 3, there's a famous quote from Marshall Goldsmith, Dr. Marshall Goldsmith, that says, what got you here won't get you there. You need, and this is one of the favorite exercises I do with executives in transition, you need to reflect on your new reality. What is going to be different in your new role compared to what you used to be doing before? And how are you going to respond to that? And last but not least, I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, have heard or read the book called The First 90 Days. It's a wonderful book The problem with that book is it's nowhere near sufficient for transitioning at the executive level. And as you see, my double diamond framework, phase 2 is the first 90 days. It's only one of the 7 phases that exist for an executive in transition. So, by the way, let me recap here. Exponentially challenged executives are more likely to fail. As we know, 4 out of 10 do not make it. It's surely a very expensive undertaking if you were just to bring in the best and hope that they're going to make it and be successful. It gets very lonely at the top, and that's why you need to equip your executive leaders with a solid process, support from HR, but most importantly, an executive transition coach. And it's not like we have no idea what works in practice. So success is not a matter of failure or luck or bad luck or good luck. It's plannable and repeatable. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you wanted to get your hands on a copy of the slides, send me a LinkedIn connection invite, and I will send you the full deck. Thank you.